Okay, great. Well, everybody, I think we're actually going to get started now. So welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be talking about technology in the social sector and how we can leverage data to build a bright and equitable future. I'm hosting, obviously, and with me are my lovely colleagues, Matt and Dina. Matt is in Edmonton and Dina is in Abbotsford, but since I'm the host, I will be doing the land acknowledgement. So I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfirst First Nation tribes, the Siksika, the Piikani, the Ganaya, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation tribes of the Chiniki, Bearspaw and Wesley, and the Sutena First Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Okay, so just a quick overview of the next hour or so. We're going to talk about help seeker, technology and data, and then data in the wild. Matt's going to take us through data for decision support, and then Dina in Abbotsford will talk about the data and technology in action. Questions, please put them into the chat or zip Jenny an email and we'll do questions at the end of the session. All right, so as host, I'm going to set the scene here. So I just would like to talk a little bit about how technology is transforming the social service sector. Obviously, everybody knows about virtualization. We're all aware that one of the results of the COVID-19 pandemic has been this acceleration of virtual interaction. Our meetings have become a lot more accessible and they are able to include so many more people, and we've got products like Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Because we can have these meetings at home, so many people can now join as long as they've got access to technology, so those devices. And we know that smartphones and internet access has become a basic need now in Canada. The good thing is that we're able to brainstorm and share ideas, and all of this data is much easily collected in digital form and able to be analysed. The internet, we have this basic library at our fingertips. We've got access to information everywhere. It's a treasure trove of information, and it's a great resource for social service staff as well. We can learn about best practices. We can learn about new methodologies at the touch of a button. We can stay current on all of the different tasks and workflows in the office, and so it can give us more time to actually focus on our clients. So we've got all of this technology moving around us, and especially accelerated this past year, and it produces data. So we have this digital collection and organization of social servers, and this information can be linked together, and it's able to show us interrelated impacts that are really hard to correlate without having these technologies and this software to help us process and understand this information. It's going to help us visualize the hidden trends in our communities and can better predict and thus prescribe social needs of the future. For example, just thinking about our work in the sector, we're looking at multiple factors like immigration, population diversity, the actual pandemic, infection rates, economic changes, education levels. All of these together can impact homelessness or social needs on a much at the local scale, and then how it's interacting provincially and then also nationally. And we can only really understand this with this rich collection of data and this organization data. So this is where we're kind of dipping our toes into artificial intelligence and machine learning. So this is what I want to talk about actually for the next 5 minutes, really about us. We've seen this real acceleration of our work into more data focused activities with the communities that we help. So, as you know, we are a B Corp social enterprise. We were the brainchild of Travis and Alina Turner back in 2017 with their work in communities, and now Help Seeker is in over 200 communities across Canada. We went from, like, I think maybe 7 staff at the end of 2019 to now 35 staff, and all of the individuals, we specialise in tech development, data management, strategy consulting, change management, and research and social innovation. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Obviously, our revenue model is data as a service and fee for service. And one of the best things that we've been able to secure is great partnerships with municipalities, system funders, decision makers, and private, public, non-government organisation service providers. Having these relationships are so important because it enables us to get a really good understanding of the different levels in a community, from what's happening at grassroots level to what's happening up in the policy areas. So just to really hone in on the actual things that we do, we are a systems mapping and analytics service provider. We have a platform that supports efforts to enhance service integration and collective impact on a variety of different social challenges, from homelessness to safety to domestic violence, to housing and health opportunities in a community. We offer a full stack of systems planning and integration solutions, and we really want to focus on strengthening the social safety net. Our key areas of focus are obviously information and data. That's why we're here today. So our staff look at information that municipalities and systems leaders need to make decisions so that people in the community can benefit. We also have expertise with research, insights, and obviously our consulting. We really need to understand what the community thinks about in terms of how effective their current social safety net is and how it can be improved, particularly the gaps in the social safety net and what opportunities exist. And we need to pull on data to get a good understanding of all of this information. And Help Seeker, we provide tools and technology and an implementation strategy as well to help communities implement these new tech processes and new ways of doing things. We hope to explore the different barriers that communities are experiencing and then put forth solutions on how to move ahead and reach targets. We want to improve the experience of clients and staff within the system of care, so we focus on efficiencies and what's working. And then we also want to standardize things as well, so everybody's on the same page and they have a good understanding of what's expected for people. So we've got all this technology and it's creating data. So how can we leverage this information? So one of our big tool that we do offer communities is obviously our system mapping tool. The system mapping software is a comprehensive real-time inventory of community services with program level occupancy information, capacity information, service components, eligibility, prioritization criteria. So basically it's a live real-time asset map for you if you do decide to start using this in your community. It's a platform. It can help system leaders better understand what service duplications there are, if there's any gaps, user trends, any feedback they have on people accessing the different agencies, what user demand is, and we even have back-end information on sources of funding. And these are the kind of analytics that a community can use to create an agile, data-driven approach to have really I think, thorough and meaningful systems planning activities underway. We also help communities manage their data. So client information management systems. These support consistent practice for client assessment, referrals, and information sharing, and they prevent clients from having to retell their story each time they access a service. So we absolutely can help communities find the right community information management system for their local needs. Things like conducting and recording assessments of client needs, searching and clearing and sharing client records with client consent, and also restricting access if needed because of privacy or safety issues. So those are the kind of aspects that we can help implement within communities, and these all form data points as well. So we help communities manage their data. And then the other highlight I'd like to focus on is the we basically gather data, community data as well, which is representative of local communities. So we do integrated needs assessments and we do social impact audits. The needs assessments use data and community input to determine priorities and strategies and goals in a more integrated manner, so that people can understand the connections and the feedback loops that are actually happening in a community, and what some of the results are with current social needs. Social impact audits. This is a systemic approach to capture and analyse funding sources at a service delivery level, and then we can match these to key performance indicators, so we can identify opportunities for communities to, I guess, make their funding interventions more, their investments more effective. So what this all means together then is, as you listen to Matt and Dina, I really want you to think about where your community is on this journey into data maturity. So data maturity, it's a measurement of how advanced your community data analysis is. A high level of data maturity is the stage reached when data is woven into the fabric of how a community operates, and what data has become incorporated in the decision making that the community makes as well. So please think about how your community can move from business reporting into business intelligence, and then actually look at making improvements based on sophisticated data models. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to the experts in the field. Matt, you are the star here that can talk more about this information. Over to you.
Thanks, Chantel. Yeah, I mean, I'm the VP of Innovation at Help Seeker, but I've had a bit of a circuitous route to get here. Spent some time in academia, public sector, private sector. And it's interesting because I remember going from a hospital to a very private sector focused company, and thinking, you know, the data, the technology is all going to be great. It's going to be so streamlined. Everyone's going to love technology, and it's just going to work. And soon I was shown how very wrong I was. Data and technology for any sector is hard to deal with. There's a change management aspect. There's just trying to figure out how you actually drive value and don't waste money, things like that. That being said, though, we're in a fantastic time and place for data and technology for any sector, but especially the social sector, in the fact that we have such an opportunity to really democratize access to better information, to better decision making, to better services to the people who most need them. So hopefully, what will come across in my talk today will be about why data is so important now, what can we do with the data, and what technology can do to really help us in the lens of not, big evil machines, but how it can actually be a huge driver for democratization of access to services, access to better outcomes. Next slide, please, Chantel. So one big thing we're experiencing these days is a huge explosion in data. I mean, I remember when I was younger, on a dial-up connection, if a website had a picture, 15 seconds to wait is nothing. Versus now, what we're looking at is companies worry about, tens or hundreds of milliseconds, because if they're slower than that, they'll lose customers. So data is just exploding, even with how much data we generate as an individual. For myself, I have my Apple Watch, I have my phone, I have my computer. If I drive, I'm interacting with GPS or perhaps traffic monitoring. If I shop, I'm interacting with the store and generating data there. So there's just so much data out there right now. And we, as you can see from this graph, we just generate more and more and more. That being said, data itself doesn't mean much. It's what we do with the data. And it's especially important because the benefit of data is not uniform. Like, for example, Apple Watch data, there's a ton out there, but what use does it have for someone experiencing chronic homelessness? So one of the big things is what we do with data and how we use it is what's really going to define value for us. Next slide, please. So the economist came out with a great analogy of data is a new oil in the world. And we can argue kind of the accuracy of that, but I think it's a great analogy because oil in itself is kind of useless to us as an individual. I don't have, cans of oil sitting around my house. It's only when I take that oil or gas and put it into a car, put it into an engine, that it has value. And it's the same thing with data, where it's only when you actually use that data, when you analyze it, when you use AI or analytics, that you get the value, that you get kind of the car of this analogy. And so the big question we have is not, there's a lot of data, but what does it mean? How do we use it? How can it help us in decision making? Because more and more we're seeing people coming out and saying, data's great, but you can't just collect data. And this isn't just individuals saying it, but big names in technology, big names in medicine, things like that. A great example is most of the data we generate in healthcare in the province isn't really going to be used if regularly, if at all. And so how do we actually go from a system where in the social sector, we don't just care about, we need data, but what data makes a difference to us, to the people who use the system, to policymakers. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd give an example here of how this can work in mortgage rates. A lot of people won't experience, getting a mortgage, especially in locations like Toronto or Vancouver. But I like it because it's an example that's well known, and it's something that's easy to digest. So if we strip away a lot of the complexity with a mortgage, you're looking at one of two options. One is a fixed rate mortgage, where you pay a bit of a premium to lock in an insurance rate, or a variable rate mortgage, where you pay a bit less in interest, but it varies over time. And so a lot of information can go into this decision making. And normally what we do is we go to experts at our bank, a mortgage broker, things like that, to help us make that decision. We put our trust in others to, make a good decision, not have other interests like commissions, things like that, and also have the right answer for us. Next slide, please. But if we look at the decision itself, it's so hard for the individual to make this without experience or a lot of time. Like this graph shows, we can look at historical averages of mortgages. We can look at leading economic indicators. There's personal information that goes into the decision, like risk tolerance. With all of this, though, it's really hard to make that better decision without help. And right now, we often default to going to the experts in the field. Now, this has two flaws. One is even experts aren't necessarily great at decision making. And the other part is access to this really important information to save money, to make a better decision. If you're in a small town versus you're in downtown Toronto, you're going to have different access to expertise and information. So this creates a really unbalanced playing field. And this isn't just found in mortgage rates. A great example is in investing. Especially historically, the more money you had, the better information, the better access you had to expertise, and potentially the more you could make on the market. Now, this is changing a little bit with robo-advisors and some of the technology, but this is one of the great things about technology. If used properly, it can provide a much more level playing field in time. But getting back to mortgage rates, we can get so into the weeds here. But what if instead of depending on a third party, what if depending on expertise that may or may not be available to you, you could actually have the information to make the best decision possible? Next slide, please. So what if we could, rather than just dealing with this whole space of information, provide the best information, so the most pertinent, so it might be, it'll ask you your risk tolerance, it'll look at the past 5 years of mortgage rates, it'll look at predictions for the economy and say, based on this information, it suggested that a variable rate mortgage would be the best, but also display the information so you can make an informed choice. And so this is where it gets interesting with technology, is it's not just about taking the decision away, but it's really about empowering the decision, because it's so easy to think of technology as a black box, but it has such a great benefit to explain. And it's interesting because I saw an interview with Bill Gates recently talking about his thoughts on the potential for misinformation of the internet. And his response was, yes, it is a big problem, but holy cow, we can do so much and learn so much more with the current state of the internet as well. I know when I was doing academic research, even I'd say 10 years before I started, you'd have to go to the library, request a paper, get it in, read it, find out whether or not it was useful to you, and then essentially go from there. Versus when I was doing my research, I could just hop online, search all the top journals, get obscure papers from, a very small university in India, and get the best information possible. So this is what I mean by the potential for democratization. Yes, there is risks of misinformation and wrong decisions, but it still has such power to help us. Next slide, please. So if we look at the social sector and social issues, one issue we're presented with is the sheer complexity of this. If we look at something like chronic homelessness, it's not just whether or not they have a job. There's mental health, there's addictions, there's historical trauma, there's all these different parts that go into this. So it can be so daunting to say, yes, I want to look at data, because there's so much out there and we don't even understand all these connections. And so it can be quite a challenge. But I can say from now, having worked in a few different industries, there is a big fear of complexity. But complexity is always an abstract notion. And unless we actually confront it, unless we start looking at least bite-sized pieces of that complexity or of that data, we're never going to advance. And this is why I think it's so important to look at not just how hard the task is, but how can we start? Next slide, please. So really, it all begins with data, and data really needs to be wrangled and understood. I won't go into the technical terms on this slide, but think of it as a pipeline. It's so important to start because unless you use the data, it's going to be of poor quality. There's going to be important data that's not there, and you're not going to get the value from it. The example I'll give is I was working at a hospital in Ontario, and I was looking at a project in the OR and pulling from a provincial database. Now, for the most, I'd say, common procedure, the procedure you'd expect the least variation. The variation in the database was plus minus 50%. So essentially, if you're looking at 100, it could range from 50 to 150, which is a huge range for something that should be the most standardized. And it wasn't that the data reflected true variation. It was just that no one used this data, so no one paid attention to the data quality, and the way this data was prepared was poor. Which, to be fair, if it's not going to be used, if it's not going to drive value, why spend time, effort, and money when it can be spent on other areas that could really help people? So this happens in every industry I've been a part of, worked with, or even just kind of passed through temporarily. It all starts with using that data, because first you look at things like what's missing. So if an important piece of information is the first 3 letters of zip code or area code, if 50% of those values are missing, that's not usable. You're also looking at things like if there's a lot of errors in the data, stuff like that, just basic data quality indicators. But then you also have to look at, can I actually compare disparate data sets? So these days, you never just look at one data set. You look at ones from all over the place, whether it's weather, whether it's StatsCan, whether it's local municipality data. But the problem there is to make them uniform, it can be a challenge. For example, StatsCan data may be in CRA tax municipalities, which you don't really need to understand, but essentially it's just chunking up the country into different regions. But then your other data set may only refer to municipalities. So you really need to make that an apples to apples comparison to have value. But after you start wrangling and using, you get to the true value of analytics. And this becomes kind of a virtuous loop wherein you start analyzing it, you start seeing value and start saying, oh, I wish I knew X, I wish I knew Y, I wish I knew or had better access to this data. And it starts a cycle where as you use it, it's not going to cover everything. You're not going to solve the whole problem right away, but it just gets better and better and better. And this is where it gets really interesting because you get to a point where you're not just doing this all ad hoc, but you're creating a full pipeline that's automated. Your data is not just getting used by you, it's getting used by other people, and there's huge benefits to the group as a whole. But there are some considerations to make before we say data is perfect. Next slide, please. There is a huge issue present in data bias. Unfortunately, this is what a lot of what gets into the news today. So a good example is Amazon, which is an amazing tech company, cutting edge on a lot of different areas. They thought, oh, we could create a recruiting tool to actually help our hiring. Part of the goal there was actually to reduce bias because in the research it's shown racial bias, things like that can happen in the interview process. What they found was there's such historical bias in the data that bias against women carried through, and therefore they scrapped it. And this isn't a unique example. Microsoft created a chatbot on Twitter that became super racist within 24 hours. So there's ways this can go wrong, for sure. And we need to understand and appreciate that bias, or the technological tools we build don't have bias, but our data does, and that's what our technological tools will use. So with this, we really need to look at what happens in our historical data. So even our, historical social norms have changed over the past 10 to 20 years, and that affects things. As you collect data, how you collect it changes, and all these considerations go in. And so this is why it's really important for the social sector to have a voice in technology and data, because I think few sectors understand it as deeply as this one does. And therefore, if we don't get involved, if we don't start looking at this, we depend on others to make these decisions for us, and that can be quite dangerous. But one of the most interesting things I found coming into the sector is I know health data a bit better, and I know bias from a health perspective. But coming in here, there's so much transferable skill sets where we can actually apply best practices and a lot of learnings from other areas to do better with the data we have to reduce that bias inherent. Next slide, please. But one thing that's really important to consider as well is I've talked all about technology, but the crux of this is decision making. And as humans, we actually aren't that great at decision making. There's a great book on this called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. But overall, we're actually a bit flawed at how we make decisions. We can often make knee-jerk reactions based on assumptions, which is great in some circumstances, but can actually be quite poor. And we often stand up human decision-making as kind of this pillar of accuracy, but it's not. If you look at even some medical specialties, when it comes to diagnosis, you can have 40, 50, 60% variability based on the same information. And that's not every decision, but that actually happens more than we think in society. And so it's not about removing the human from that loop, but it's about that information equality I was talking about, of providing the best information possible with human insight to get that best decision. And it's not about, technology versus humans, but it's about what's the accuracy, what's the quality of the decision being made today, and how can we improve it? And the best example I saw of this is they did a head-to-head comparison of radiologists versus a computer algorithm for diagnosis. Radiologist versus computer algorithm, we're talking about a percentage point, nothing big. But where it really shone is when you actually added the two together, the accuracy skyrocketed because the humans caught things the computer didn't, and the computer caught things the human didn't. And it still kept decision in the human's hands, but it really improved the quality of that underlying decision, which is so important. So this brings us to a really important piece of technology that we think will be really important in the coming years for this sector. Next slide, please. It's what's called a decision support system. So what it's really about is summarizing the data, presenting the most pertinent and important data possible, and providing a suggestion based on historical data. So how does this look in actuality? Well, maintenance is one of the fields this is being used most heavily in. So I'll give an example. Sitting at home in the kitchen, all of a sudden my fridge starts screeching, billowing smoke. I know it's either completely toast or it needs a repair. But there's all these data points that lead up to that. And it might be extra vibration in my fridge's motor. It might be how temperatures change in the fridge. So if you put some sensors, you can actually monitor this so closely. But as the fridge owner, I'm not going to be sitting on an app all day and watching this go or know, does a change of 0.2 degrees mean something? So what the technology can do is sit there and monitor that in real time, but also compare that to far more historical data than we ever would, or really we'd want to, and say, oh, I've noticed these fluctuations. I'm going to send Matt a text to say, your fridge needs maintenance within a month because these fluctuations and based on this historical data. So not only do I save my, smoking, possibly fire-inducing fridge, but I get better decision-making power with that. And so it's not about removing the human. It's almost like this decision fatigue we can run into of, I can get so into the weeds of the data, but all I really want is that highest level, based on historical data, based on subject matter expertise, what should I care about? And what does kind of the data say to me? And then I have that power of decision making. And that's what's so interesting and unique here, is it things like Google Maps. I don't want to sit down with a map and draw it where I think the best route is. I love the fact that it just tells me fastest route is this one. I still have the decision to make a route or make a change, but I have the best information to make that choice. And that's where the power of a system like a DSS can come from. But what does it mean to the social sector, and what are we working on right now? Next slide, please. One of the big things is Chantal mentioned we do data as a service, but one big piece of feedback we've received is so what? If the elderly population in my town is skyrocketing, what does that mean to me? What should I be doing? And there's also huge, I'd say, informational inequality here too, because if you're in a small town of 10,000 people, you probably don't have access to data analytics or data scientists versus, Toronto has a whole data analytics team in the city. So the decisions you make, there's going to be disparity of information because you simply don't have the resources to understand and know essentially cutting edge research and thought processes of what to do. So what we're looking at here is actually taking the data sources like raw data, so let's say StatsCan data, systems mapping data that we collect that Chantal talked about, community-specific data, everything from, let's say, traffic to health data, and really amalgamating that, curating that, and using that to help make decisions. So in one case, we looked at taking 3,000 possible variables that were curated to be somewhat related to the decision we were looking at, down to less than 15. And using those 15, how do we make the best decision possible? So think about housing needs assessment. Rather than having to do this ad hoc, we can or people who build these systems can automatically provide those key housing data points like age of population, rentals, housing availability, things like that, but also provide that insight based on not just what the data tells us, but what the subject matter expertise tells us. And this is becoming a huge field in technologies as a whole, because we're not just looking at what's the best technique, but we're being inundated with so much information on what to do. How do we curate that and understand it quickly and easily? So this is where I think it's so interesting today is there's so much power in data and technology, but it's about the translation to the sector, which I think hasn't been done holistically, especially when you're looking at, let's say, a big technology company trying to provide a solution to this sector. If we do it right, it has such power and such an ability to help people. But it's about us all having a voice and really getting on the bandwagon to start looking at this. Because that's where I think the sweet spot is of how we can use data technology to help not just the people the social sector is supposed to help, but the people in the sector to do more with less, which is the common ask today. But I'll stop there and pass it back to Chantal for Dina to give a talk.
Great, thank you so much, Matt. That was very interesting, and particularly I think what resonated for me is this decision making is flawed. I mean, we are at a point now where we no longer need to be reactive with our decision making. We can be proactive, and that shows how important historical data is. So we can look at the trends of the past and how we can predict or interpolate what's perhaps going into the future. Talking about making decisions from data, I am going to hand over now to my lovely colleague, Dina. Over to you.
Oh, thank you, Chantal, and thank you, Matt, for that presentation. It definitely gave me some food for thought as well regarding where we are at as a community with our data maturity. So I will have a conversation with everyone about that. My personal experience is that I've worked in the federal, regional, and municipal government as well as private sector. And in these respective roles, I've always worked closely with various facets of community, whether it be nonprofit, Indigenous communities, or faith communities, or various residents. And what I recognize, next slide, please, is that in all of these collective experiences that each group or each party would come to the conversation or a conflict or a various situation with their own perspective that was positioned and partial and partisan. So I appreciate Matt talking about how data is what it is, but it also is up to the the observers or the individuals interacting with the data. But data, I feel, provides us opportunity to intersect with those various mandates and regulations or needs of stakeholders in a way that we can look beyond competing interests to resolve complex issues. And so that's where our work brought us to in Abbotsford around generating an ecosystems approach to take a look at interrelated factors in how that is animated through evidence-based data-driven decision-making. Next slide, please. So with the support of Help Seeker, they have provided us integral support working through their various systems that they mobilize in their work, as they've mentioned previously. But we really wanted to take a look at how we adapted these tools in a way that made sense to our community, that actually animated our decision-making and our collaborative approach. So one is through the Hub of the Fraser Valley Community Entity. The City of Abbotsford is one of the newly designated Service Canada Reaching Home communities in Canada, tasked with responding to homelessness and vulnerability through 4 years of Service Canada funding. So we have a shared outcome measurement system to support us in responding to the mandatory community level outcomes, for example, that Service Canada has developed. But in return, through our Abbotsford Homelessness Prevention and Response System, which has been co-developed and it is collaboratively owned, mobilized and funded through over 47 community agencies, all levels of government and various facets of the community, mobilizing a systems approach across streams of delivery to respond to homelessness and vulnerability issues. And in my current role, I oversee the city's social housing, homelessness, and community infrastructure unit. So the ecosystems brought together all of these complex social issues under one umbrella, but also did it in a manner where we were not pushing people out of their mandate or respective roles, but rather taking a strength-based approach to understand the complex issue through a generative solution that we can create together to respond to these issues. And the evidence-based data provides that common ground. Next slide, please. So with respect to Help Seeker, we first engaged their support to onboard our resource directory that's front-facing to our community. We share census data with the District of Mission and City of Abbotsford. So what we wanted to ensure right off the mark is that this was an integrated resource. We recognize that there will always be homelessness and vulnerability in our community. But what we want to also ensure is as we develop a system that responds to the most vulnerable in our community, we're also creating pathways to resiliency and support. So that's why our Help Seeker database has services attached from everything to homelessness shelters, to food security, to childcare, to literacy, to mental health and wellness. And the list goes on. But what we recognized is this, by doing so pre-COVID, it really helped us to pivot quickly during COVID, because as the needs changed in our community rapidly, Help Seeker was there to support us to adapt our platform in a manner that was responsive immediately to these changing needs in our community. Next slide, please. So what we also have recognized through this data is it's the ability for us to recognize where these needs are changing in real time. It was interesting. We have a community advisory board that's very active, and we meet monthly with our city council representation as well as our agency partners and those who are involved in our homeless prevention and response system. And that day, Help Seeker was indicating how there was a new kind of hotspot emerging in the community. And as we delved in deeper, we recognized that it was actually migrant farm workers during COVID reaching out in the language of their preference to understand what type of resources were available to them. And one of our city councilors spoke up and said, this is civic engagement in action. You know, this is looking at real-time challenges with real-time data in real time. And we were able, because everyone was virtually at the table together, we were able to bring multiple perspectives to that data to truly understand how this was impacting on the ground in the community. Next slide. So also Help Seeker has been engaged to support us in the development of the community development infrastructure study. Throughout my work, working with different levels of government and throughout various sectors, again, I see the common ground is not so much about the position that we take or the mandate and regulations that we have to adhere to, but it's rather the common ground of looking at what infrastructure is needed and required to respond to the needs in the community. This also builds on the functional zero definition of homelessness that I know Dr. Alina Turner has written extensively about, but it actually helps us to understand as a community, and Chantel said it earlier, about how the data helps to inform even funding decisions in the background, where, you know, this was part of this work that was instrumental. There was a housing needs assessment conducted, but with that, we linked it to a poverty reduction strategy, age-friendly policy update for vulnerable seniors, a childcare needs assessment and update, and that all of that work combined, bringing it together, developed our community development infrastructure strategy study that had a robust community engagement process attached to it as well. And that, because it was data informed, we had a foundational baseline to work from that was able to bring these multiple experiences together in a manner that recognized the relationships between housing and health and community services, with the overarching goal to improve outcomes for the residents of Abbotsford, quality of life, and also resiliency, creating a more adaptive, well-funded, well-resourced system. Next slide. So I perhaps jumped the queue on this slide, but this really shows you how these various pieces of this study have all been data informed. So the analysis was really critical then as we went out in the community with our multi-stakeholder technical advisory groups to have an informed conversation about data and how data rolls out in community or informs or impacts or influences the decisions. And the community then can help to inform that collective narrative as well. And so we appreciate the support of Help Seeker, and we've received Union of British Columbia municipality funding to complete these requirements. But at the end of the day, it develops a community data book that multiple stakeholders can utilize for decision making. Next step, or slide, thank you. So because it was during COVID, Help Seeker helped us even to pivot rapidly in the process that we used for community engagement. We were able to utilize virtual design labs in a way that multiple people could have conversations. Also, an online public survey that was provided in multiple languages. And in addition to that, we had COVID-safe social distanced pods that provided training and resources to local people and key change leaders to facilitate dialogues with various people out in community that may not always engage in traditional municipal ways of seeking community engagement. So again, it was bringing that increased equity and inclusion and democracy to how data was being utilized to support conversation. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, now we have a community data book in final draft form. And so the way this will be utilized for municipal government then is for us to continue to support decision-making across departments within the mandate of municipal government, effectively inform advocacy to senior levels of government who have the mandate. But in addition to that, will be utilized as a resource by our community agencies when they are completing grant applications, our community as we come together in our systems collective, when we're monitoring and evaluating how data is representative of trends and priorities and changes in our community. And overall, I think brings us along that point of continuum of data maturity. Are we there yet? No. Are we growing together? Yes. And what we do see in our community is that there's a commitment to grow together. And having an open data source helps to bring the more equitable ground for these conversations to continue. Next slide. This is exciting to me, and I'm so grateful for Help Seeker in helping us to bring multiple data points together. So in the first slide, when we talked about an ecosystems approach, this is a tangible example of that. How various factors, data that may have never been on the same page together, come together focused on one specific issue. And you can start seeing how poverty and inequality indicators come from various places. So as individuals are positioned and focused in their own domains or departments or roles or responsibilities, coming together with looking at a dashboard like this, you can start recognizing how your piece of what you do may influence or impact the outcome. And it can also help us come together to understand how together we can generate a solution. And from an intergovernmental perspective, this is exciting opportunity for policy advocacy that will extend beyond the horizon of election cycles as well. This brings the human factor to the observations that are required for collective and transformative systems change. Next slide. Thank you, Chantal.
Great, thank you so much, Dina. Actually, that was an incredible summary of a year of very hard work, working on systems transformation in your community. But absolutely, just listening to you talk, it was a privilege and a pleasure to work with you, because to see what we managed to do just in 1 year makes me very proud, and also I'm sure the rest of the Help Seeker team that worked very, very closely with you to conduct all of these various projects and the outcomes of it as well. So thank you so much for that. All right, everyone, we had two very eloquent speakers there, so thank you so much. Jenny, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm sure there's a bunch of questions. Let's go.
Well, thanks so much, Chantal and Matt and Dina, for those wonderful presentations. It was super informative and I really appreciated it. So thank you so much. Before we head on to the Q&A session, I wonder, Chantal, if you can just move to the last slide there, and I'll just talk about a quick save the date for our next webinar, which will be March 18th. At 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time or 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The theme will address how to develop an integrated coordinated access using a human-centered lens by co-creating and designing processes alongside people that will actually be using the support services. So that should be a great webinar and super interesting. So I hope you can all join us. And I'll certainly send out the link later on, and you're welcome to share with anyone else that you feel would be interested. So now on to the Q&A session. So, honestly, at this point, we've only really had one question come through, and that is this consultation done over the phone, Zoom, or in person? So, that could be something that either Matt or Chantal are welcome to take on if you like.
Sorry, Jenny, what was the question?
The question is consultation done over the phone, Zoom meeting, or in person? So over Zoom or in person. So that'd be consultation with help seeker.
Oh, well,
I believe, at least. Yeah.
Consultation with us can be any medium you like. That's not a problem. If it's with your client, obviously there will need to be some back and forth there with what's appropriate for the client, whether internet access is available and if devices are available, because obviously we're living in the age of physical distancing now, and virtualization has become the norm. But it's really just picking and choosing what type of virtualization works for you. I mean, with our consultations, we have done design labs using Miro or Focus Group it. We have done Zooms, we have done webinars, we use Microsoft Office, we use Skype. So really whatever is available out there, and depending on what community needs, we're able to adapt. I hope that helps.
Thanks so much, Chantal. Yeah, I think that definitely addresses the question. That was all that we had for questions today. So unless anyone else has anything that they'd like to pop in. Oh, we've got something that just came up here. Oh, it was just a comment from Sharon that said, this is not the age of social distancing. It is ending soon. So thanks, Sharon, for that comment. Yeah. Oh, another question just came in. In the city's project, how were the services and communities identified and engaged? So Dina, did you want to take on that question?
I can do that. So I think we started our collective systems work back in 2015. And so our community agencies came to the table early on in 2015, as well as we were able to have committed engagement by all levels of government and their statutory agencies. And in addition to that, we continue to kind of grow out kind of collective efforts with the various components in community. And so we had already built kind of our collaborative, our collective of knowing who we wanted to reach out to, or who some of our cornerstone agencies or steward leaders were to engage various individuals or communities within our municipality. So that was a really valuable resource for us to tap into to start the specific community development infrastructure strategy study work. And so with that, because we also had multi-stakeholder technical advisory groups for each one of these projects, those representatives also had their own networks attached to the focus area. And so we were able to tap into those networks to support some of the kind of socially distanced kind of smaller pod engagements that were in person, as well as bringing people virtually into the conversation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dina. And so Shiva asked, how did communities with barriers to technology get engaged?
So I think that would be through the various opportunities for those community conversations to happen. So what Help Seeker did is they supported our community in helping with the training for the facilitators who were to facilitate those conversations with the community. And then their input was brought in to kind of a overarching document that was agreed upon with the individuals that were there. And so that information helped to inform the study, as well as the survey. There were some copies that were printed out, and conversations were had with that as well. And we always opened opportunity for agencies to go back to talk to their own client communities that they supported and served through the process. And then also because we have ongoing conversations attached to our systems work, that also helped us to bring in those perspectives ongoing as well. So it kind of supported and bridged some of the barriers to technology.
Terrific. And Chantal, I mean, you've done quite a bit of work alongside communities. Is there anything else that you wanted to add? I know that kind of pre-COVID, we had different, with COVID now we can't really do as many in-person groups, but pre-COVID, did you want to discuss some of the other ways that we engaged communities?
Pre-COVID, obviously, we would go into the community and do our face-to-face design labs or focus groups or open houses. Yeah, so things obviously are a little bit different now, and I expect them to be different this year as well, but hopefully we will go back to having that human touch versus a virtual touch sooner rather than later.
Perfect, thank you. So a question did come in. Can any of the panelists comment further on the idea that data is a tool, not an endpoint for our work? Matt, do you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I can take first crack. The big thing about data is there's great power in data, but there's a great article by venture capital firm out of Silicon Valley about how we try to build these almost data moats, but the moat is not protection. It's not useful in itself. It's what we do with it. Data is so important because it is the first step along this process, but it is by no means the end all be all. I know I've worked a while in healthcare, and we sit on such a treasure trove of data that could really help people, but we oftentimes do so little with it, from standardizing practices to treating people better to trying to flag when people need more help than a doctor caught. And so I don't want to belittle the point of data collection is so important, but really it is kind of that gas in the car. Until we do something with it, it's great to have all this data, but the amount we spend on data collection versus the improvement outcomes we get is a mismatch because we don't use it as a tool. Oftentimes we just kind of let it sit there, and that doesn't work. So I don't want to belittle data on its own, but without doing something with it, you're missing out on so much value.
Thanks, Matt. That sounds great. Well, that's all we've got for now, everyone. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time to join us once again. We are so pleased to have such a great turnout of people to present to. So thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you next month, and I'll be sending out the recording and the slideshow presently. So take care, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.